December sees the end of a year of celebrations in the Irish Planning Institute, marking 50 years since it was first founded in 1975.
That's why I set out to do was to basically try and simplify planning to help people understand what it is we do.
December also sees the end of the term of office of the current council of the Institute and a range of governance changes, including the election of a reshaped Board of Directors. To look back at their term of office, the state of planning today, and the prospects for 2026, I'm joined by Gavin Lawlor, who is coming to the end of a 2-year term as President of the IPI, and Philip Jones, who is a past President of the Institute and outgoing Honorary Secretary. So I'm going to start with you, Gavin. Can you talk about your career today? That's what led you to planning in the first place and your career up until you became President of the IPI?
Well, my career starts a very curious journey. I wanted to be an architect, or thought I wanted to be an architect when I started first in school. Unfortunately, I didn't get that, or maybe fortunately for some, I didn't get the points in my leaving cert to do architecture. So I went on and I did social science, not knowing what it was. Didn't particularly enjoy it, although it has been quite seminal for me, forming some of my views and helping me in understanding social issues and social problems. I wasn't hugely excited by it. And in third year, I went into the careers office and sort of talked to them in UCD about what I could do. And they introduced me to the idea of town planning, which I'd never heard of. Looked up the course, got interested in it, went in and spoke to some of the lecturers, got really interested in it. Did my interview, didn't get an offered a place at first, was on a waiting list, got in last minute, and the very first thing I did was a lecture from Michael O'Donnell on the kill dump, and I was hooked. I was a planner from then on. So that's how I got in. Early career, I started with my career with Michael O'Neill in Howth, mainly doing development plans and plan work. Before that I worked with Fingal for 6 months. And then I went from Michael to work with John Reid for about a year in consultancy, writing EIA chapters, social impact assessments, and looking at motorways and their effects, economic effects. And that was with Jim Eustace, the late Jim Eustace. And then I moved on to Frank Benson and Partners. I started with Frank as a photographer, not even as a planner, taking photographs of comms masts around the country, and I got to know the country from doing that. Then I progressed through the ranks in Frank Benson and Partners, became a specialist in there on quarries, then moved on. When Frank died, Tom decided to set up his own practice, Tom Phillips that is, and I've been with Tom Phillips now ever since the inception of Tom Phillips Associates.
And the most important thing about that Frank Benson experience was you had earrings and long hair, which
I had lots.
I think
of
it's something
hair.
A lot of people don't know.
Well, my dad did warn me when I had my long hair. He said, "Son, you'll regret having that now because all you're doing is tearing it out of your head, so you'll go bald when you're older." And he was right.
And Philip, where did you study planning and what led you to do planning in the first place?
Well, like a lot of planners around, I started off in my bachelor's degree in geography in Trinity. And basically, while I was in Trinity, one of the courses obviously in geography was urban planning in third year, and I got interested in it. But I was also heavily involved while I was in Trinity, but this is between 73 and 77, in student politics. And one of the things I joined was a kind of a lobby group of students trying to lobby Dublin Corporation for the re-pedestrianisation of Grafton Street. I mean, it's difficult to think of it now, but they actually did a trial of pedestrianisation in Grafton Street for about a year in the early 70s, and then they closed it down again and let cars in. And apparently it was because the major stores at the time, Brown Thomas's and Switzer's, were not happy because their customers weren't able to drive to the door. They were also worried that there might be hippies and buskers and other undesirables in Grafton Street. And needless to say, the corporation's roads department weren't happy with any diminution of access for car owners, so no surprise there. So this activity, while I was in undergrad, imbued me kind of with a preference for the common good over vested interests, which has remained with me ever since. I suppose you could say, some people would say perhaps a bit too much. And then when I went on to UCD to do the Masters in Regional and Urban Planning, I was also during the time on the Wood Quay marches, which again was an indication of how things went. But during the MRUP course in UCD between 77 and 79, I was strongly pressured by one of the lecturers to join what he described as the Senior Institute, which of course is the RTPI. I demurred because I thought that IPI was more radical and nonconformist of the two. And I think so the IPI has remained. The IPI is always seeking to change the status quo and work for the betterment of our citizens and the environment, rather than supporting the establishment. And that was typified at the time by the planners in the Custom House and in Dublin Corporation. It was actually well known, if you were a planner and you wanted to get a job in either of those places, you had to be a member of the Senior Institute, and there was no point in going for interview otherwise. But I stayed with the IPI, and I was invited in 86 to join the Institute Council by the late Enda Conway. And I served as a co-opted member until 89, and then I was elected on many, many occasions. I took a break between 93 and 96. So I've been on the council now for a fairly long time. I've actually worked it out that I've spent time on the IPI Council for 26 and a quarter years of its 50-year time. So I was lucky enough to be on the council. I served as Honorary Secretary to no less than 7 IPI presidents. And then I was then honoured to be elected president myself for a 2-year term from 1999 to 2001. Those with longer members may recall that was the time of the Flood Tribunal, and was also on the 25th anniversary of the Institute. So it's been quite a journey. In terms of work, I started as an assistant planner in Waterford City Council in 1980, serving in that role till 82. I was then very lucky because at the time there were negotiations with the government about what the qualifications should be for the higher grades. And it went on for 4 years between the union and the management, which was the County Managers Association. So at the time then, no jobs were filled. So I ended up between 82 and 86 in Waterford City Council being the chief planner on a temporary 6-month rolling basis. So I finally got a permanent job in 86 when I went in as county planner into Kildare County Council. Stayed there for 13 years to 99, and then I moved to Bord Pleanála, and I was senior planning inspector from 99 to 2007, then assistant director from 2007 to 2014, and then I was appointed by the minister as a board member. And I served as a board member of the board from 2014 to 2020, when, having done 41 years in the public sector, I decided it was time to retire. Actually, no, I didn't decide it. It was still those silly rules that existed that you had to retire at the age of 65. So that's my career. Unlike Gavin, mine has entirely been in the public sector. And I never went to the private. I know there were quite a number of people in the board in the early 2000s who said, oh, the Celtic Tiger is roaring, I'll get out of the board as an inspector and go and work in the private sector. I didn't. So that's the background to my experience.
And after your period on the board, you came back onto the IPI Council, and that's really what I want to talk to both of you about today, is looking back over the last couple of years in the IPI Council. Philip, you as Honorary Secretary again, and Gavin as President for the last 2 years. And looking back at the last 2 years in the IPI, the last 2 years in planning, and then looking ahead to the future. But for you first, Gavin, what has been the main issue for planning, in your opinion, in the last 2 years? What has been the thing that in work and in the IPI has taken up most of your time and has taken up most of your conversations?
I suppose it's down to housing, and more housing, and everything that facilitates or interferes with the ability to be able to deliver housing. And on top of that, then the whole concept that planners are the root problem and cause of all evil when it comes to the housing crisis. They were the two things that really sort of resonate for me over the period of my presidency. The other thing that was of particular import to me when I became president and when I joined the Institute's Council first 4 years ago was to bring planning into the mainstream, to make it more relevant, to help to explain to the general public and to people why planning is important, but more particularly how they should and can become engaged in the planning process and how they can shape their own futures, and to try and dispel some of the general NIMBYism that's out there, and understandably out there when people don't understand or comprehend what are in the various different plans and why they're there.
One of your conference speeches, you talked about planners and planning being scapegoats. And I think there's two things there. One is planners as a profession and us as planners, and then the planning system and the two things getting confused, and then on top of that other things getting layered onto the planning system which are nothing to do with planners at all. But why do you think planners and planning maybe have become that sort of scapegoat, and is that still happening, and what do you think we can try and do to actually balance that conversation?
Well, I think everybody has planning is to an extent it's social, to an extent there's a bit of geography in it, and everybody has an opinion about where they live. Everybody has a pair of eyes and a pair of ears and a very large mouth that they can use to express their views, and they're entitled to do so, and we have to listen when a community speaks. But often the engagement is, and I mean this respectfully, uneducated. It's coming from a particular perspective. And the key and the magic that planning brings, or planners bring to those circumstances, is balance. We're trained, both through experience and through what we do in college, to look at things from multiple different angles. To use another analogy, we make the smoothie, we throw all the different fruit in together, mix it all up together and create a wonderful drink, hopefully. And I think the reason that the planners have been scapegoated is because it's very easy for everybody to have an opinion on planning. It's very topical, it's very current, it's very obvious, it's outside your door. And so what it shows is that people really do care about what's happening to them in their environment and to their community. Unfortunately, we as a society, both from a governmental perspective and from an industry perspective in town planning, we haven't managed to engage with the communities that we look to serve, or at least we haven't engaged with them well enough to help them understand. The other thing that's happened is planning suddenly has become topical. Way back when I started planning, I didn't even know what it was. Most people didn't. And if you said you were a town planner, everybody scratched their head, and you had to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes trying to explain what you do. Now, if you say you're a town planner, it's like, ooh. And, the conversation goes on from there. And if you say that you work for the commission, or, there's another bigger double woof. So I think it's become very challenging to be in the profession because we spend a lot of time trying to explain our decisions, whether in the consultancy world, whether in the local authority world, on Bord Pleanála, semi-state. We're trying to explain the whole time. And we're trying to explain to people who tend to be annoyed about a circumstance because they had a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation, or things have been misreported. And the media have a lot to blame for the crisis in planning and the scapegoating of planners, because it's very easy to point a finger and say, ask somebody, why is this happening? And everybody wants to know who's responsible for it. So, well, let's blame somebody. The planners are an easy target. And the last thing is, the other reason I think we're scapegoated is we have a poor voice, or have had in the past a poor voice. It is very, very, very challenging for an inspector in Bord Pleanála to put their hand up and say, hold on a second, that's not fair, if they're referenced in a judgment. And that has happened. People have been specifically named in judgment, which I think is fundamentally wrong. You have people in local authorities who are going to find it difficult to have a voice because of where they sit and who they report to. So it can be very, very challenging for planning and the planning community to have a voice and say, hold on a second here, that's just not right, and you've totally misunderstood this. And equally so, planning is complex, and we do have a horrible habit as a profession. We're going down rabbit holes and getting very, very interested in very, very niche topics and talking for hours on them. And so, as my wife would say, I bored the pants off her. And that's another issue that we have with that presents a challenge in terms of properly communicating.
Philip, based on what Gavin was saying there, how do you think the perception of planners and the perception of planning has changed over the 40 plus years of your career, from coming out first from UCD to today? What do you think? Do you think planning is better understood? Do you think planners have become more or less vilified, or how do you think the profession is perceived maybe?
Well, I think it depends on the audience. When I started out, I worked as I mentioned, in a city authority for 6 years, and planning was seen as a good thing because it was getting what was a very depressed area back in the early 80s in Waterford City, trying to get things to happen. And one of the things I enjoyed most in working there was you could get things done. It wasn't all about, as we used to call it, develop and control. I mean, for example, while I was in there, we got grants for unemployed people to take people off the live register. We basically organised archaeological digs in the city, with the foreman being an archaeologist and the lads being the guys getting them off the plateau to actually do the digging. That started something which ended up in what's now known as the Viking Triangle in Waterford, and it's a huge input into the economy there. So you can do things, particularly in a city environment, where the planner is seen as somebody who works for the local authority, but also works for the public. Very different than in Kildare County Council, when for 13 years, planners were seen as the people who wouldn't let Mrs. Murphy or whoever build a house in the middle of the countryside because they just happen to have the money or the connections to do it. So it very much depends, I suspect, on the audience that is doing that. More recently, I'd agree with Gavin, the big issue in the public arena has been housing. But in fact, there's a much bigger issue that affects planning now, and that is climate change. We're no longer allowed, and planners are part of the solution to that, we're no longer allowed to zone land in floodplains. That was the norm back in the day. Equally, I think most people now make a distinction between planners who do the, if you like, the advice to the decision makers and the decision makers again, themselves. I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, if you talk to planning, most people, they'd immediately think of county councillors and brown envelopes. One of the enjoyable things I had when I was president, when the whole flood tribunal thing was going on, was being able to point out to the public, through press releases and so on, that not a single planner throughout all of that period was hauled before the tribunals for corruption. Whereas many councillors, many of whom were named in the public arena, and one or two thankfully went to jail over it, were seen as corrupt. And I think the general reaction to the public is, yeah, the planner might say yes, might say no. It might affect me yes or no, but I know the decision is honest and unbiased. And I think that is something that the IPI has been able to bring forward to the public as well. But the other big issue is the public discourse about planning. I would say there's a lot of very ill-informed commentators out there who like to scapegoat planners because it's the easy target. Some of those are ill-informed, but a lot of other of those are what I would call vested interest commentators, particularly those working for property firms and economists who think only in Thatcherite terms of less regulation rather than more. And I have to say there are quite a number of bad actors out in public discourse, particularly over the last year. And they're the ones who are scapegoating planners. Infrastructure is not being held up by planning. Housing, to a large degree, is not being held up by planning. I mean, I don't know if you saw the news there about the housing plan. They're trying to activate 40,000 units in Dublin, which the planning system has brought through and has granted, and yet we're being blamed for holding it up. Now, there is another issue as well, which is everybody goes on about the speed of decision making. That has an underlying idea that you have a right to develop your land. The High Court about 6 years ago very clearly said there is no constitutional right to develop land, only to own it and to make sure it's not taken away from you by way of compulsory purchase without proper compensation. But there isn't a right to develop land, and unfortunately a lot of people seem to think just because they own land, whether that's a half acre in the middle of nowhere or on the edge of a town that hasn't been zoned yet, I'm entitled to develop it. And again, planners are seen as interfering in the so-called property rights of landowners or developers. So the IPI has been able, over the last, I'd say, 20 years, but much more so in the last 10, of being the people who are asked by the commentators and by interviewers and so on about planning. That wasn't always the case. When I started in the Institute and right through the 90s, the only way we got our voice heard was to write a letter to the editor and hope that it was published. Now, as soon as something comes up, as you know, and I'm sure Gavin knows as well, you'll get a phone call from some reporter saying, right, this come out, what is the planners plan? What do the planners think about this? Give us a quote, give us a couple of sound bites. So the IPI has done a huge amount in educating the public about what good things planning can do, rather than being seen solely in development control contexts as regulators.
And that media stuff is something that's kept Gavin very busy over the last 2 years of his term as president, but something that's kept all of us very busy has been the Planning and Development Act. Philip, you've been chair of our policy committee. Gavin, yourself, myself, a range of people in the Institute have been in front of Oireachtas committees making submissions. How significant, Gavin, maybe first, how significant do you think that act is, and how do you think the rollout of that piece of legislation is going, considering how much time and effort, I suppose, the Institute put into it on behalf of members and how much discussion there's been with members about it. I get a feeling that kind of the conversation, people aren't talking about it as much as they were a couple of years ago. But how significant do you think that piece of legislation is?
It's going to be hugely significant in time, but I think time will only tell how significant. There's quite a number of very subtle and quite a number of very significant changes in it in an attempt to streamline our system. But straight away, as soon as that legislation is passed, we're talking already government level of introducing fast tracks for infrastructure. And without getting into any criticism in relation to the situation, one of the things that have dogged our industry and dogged the whole concept of delivery is a lack of understanding of timescales and planning and how long it takes to do stuff. When you're in the middle of a development plan cycle and somebody changes the rule book, it's very, very unhelpful because you have to go back and restart certain or finish what you're doing and restart immediately. So it becomes very disheartening, very difficult for planners to deal with that. Do I think it's going to make a considerable difference in the way we practice town planning in Ireland? No. Do I think it's going to make a significant difference to the basics of what we do and do well in town planning? No. Because at the core of what we do as town planners is the concept of sustainability. And I think we understand that, or planners should understand that at a very basic level when they come out of college, and then should be able to get to practice that, whether they're in private or public sector, and implement it and educate people as to what sustainability means. We're one of the very few professions where when we've lived it, we understand it. We don't have to have it explained to us. It becomes about the balance between the three legs of the stool, whether it's environment, economy, or social. Getting that balance right. I keep coming back to that word. It's a key word in terms of what we do. Almost like a referee in finding that balance. Another visualization of what I'm talking about is the guy who's standing on the platform with a ball underneath and trying to get all of those various different actors and interests together and find that solution that sits in between the whole lot. Unfortunately, that takes time. The Planning Act, it has taken time, maybe not long enough, some would say. But one of the things I think that's a little bit unhelpful and has been unhelpful in terms of the new Act and how it's been administered and pushed forward is that lack of certainty in terms of time frame. It's something that's dogged our industry and still dogs our industry to this day as a key challenge and a key criticism in terms of how long will that take. And we have a situation now where we have the Act enacted. It's a 2024 Act. We're now at the end of 2025 and key provisions haven't been commenced yet. And it's feeling very like history repeating itself in terms of the 2000 Act. So I am a little bit concerned as to, when it comes in and how it comes in, and that we basically just repeat history and we amend the living daylights out of it before it even gets properly enacted. So in terms of how it's going to affect us, my concern is that it's going to just be a little bit more red tape and a little more red tape. One of the things that came out of our most recent colloquium, and it's something that resonated with me, was the level of complexity that we have now introduced into our system, and some of it entirely unnecessary. And it's sort of a Band-Aid type of approach. Oh, there's a problem, stick a Band-Aid on it. Before you know it, all the Band-Aids are counted up. They've amounted of Band-Aids that you have to wade through to find the cut you were trying to fix. And I think that's a real problem for us. The Planning Act, the new Planning Act, was meant to solve some of that, but it didn't, because it's pretty much 3 times the size of any other piece of legislation out there in terms of what it's trying to do. And it's effectively more than doubled the number of pages you have to read through to do something reasonably straightforward like your planning permission. And it becomes almost impenetrable as a piece of legislation. The 2000 Act, with all the amendments, was in its own right almost impenetrable. And in the new Act and learning the new subtleties of it, it's going to be a significant challenge.
And keeping on that subtleties theme, obviously we have the regulations to come. What's the most effective way of getting the practical experience of planners in the public, private, semi-state, academic sectors involved in those regulations? And I don't know, Gavin, if you can think back to the regs that followed the 2000 Act and how they kind of evolved. They need to be practical. They need to be, I suppose, collaborative. They're clearly very important. I'm wondering if you have a view on how they can be practical and stress tested and I suppose thrashed out maybe with practitioners?
To me, there's a very simple thing to do, and it's what we would do with any other planner or program that we want to implement in planning. You put a bunch of people in who are going to be immediately affected by the regulations into a room. You bring them through the regulations and the thinking around them. The people who wrote it present it. This is what we wanted to do. This is how you're thinking of doing it. This is what that means. And then you have a feedback session from the people in the room where they tease out and test the regulation and see, well, will that work? And what are the likely consequences? And is there any unforeseens that the person who wrote it didn't see? I mean, no one person or no one grouping will have the answer to all of the likely issues that are going to arise when it comes to planning regulation, given the complexity that's there, that exists. So if you put a number of key actors, NGOs, private sector, local authority planners, on-commission inspectors, people from semi-state infrastructure, people from, God forbid, the quarrying industry, into a room with a set of regulations that might apply to them if, as in the group of people that are there, they must have a vested interest in the regulations. You present the regulations, you ask a series of questions. At least you can be certain that you're going to get some appropriate feedback, some level of stress testing. You may choose to ignore some of the comments, you may choose to take them up, but at least you won't be surprised when you publish the legislation and then you're having to come back a couple of weeks later and edit or amend something.
And Philip, you've been very involved in getting the views of members, collating them, I suppose doing an internal version of that kind of stress testing thing and talking them through with the policy committee. What do you think the regulations are going to look like, or how do you think they should be rolled out in an ideal world as the Act gets commenced in full?
Well, what we've managed to do over the last 2 years in the Institute, and in fairness, probably a year before that as well, and I'll give the example of the exempted development section of the regs. We asked all our members for comments as what they would want of the existing regs change and what they'd want to keep. I think we got something like 20 or 25 submissions to the policy committee, which then went through it and then made a submission which was then, with some modifications, adopted by the IPI Council and sent into government. And our submission was 28 pages long and kind of had a summary section of about 4 pages and then went through section by section, class by class, article by article, what we felt as the practitioners who are going to have to implement it, we felt should be in those regs. And I think that's the stress testing that every bit of stuff coming out of the Custom House needs to get. The people who are actually going to work it on the ground, rather than the vested interests who are knocking at the door of the Custom House or other places, or the Taoiseach's office indeed. It's not, we don't have a vested interest as planners. We just want the planning system to work for the best of our citizens, rather than those, and fair enough, they're called stakeholders for a reason, because they have a stake. That's a phrase I hate. I don't like stakeholders because it's a Thatcherite term. Those without a stake, i.e. those without money, don't get a voice. The IPI is not a vested interest. It's actually the people who have to operate whatever comes out by way of legislation and regulations. I think perhaps over the last, particularly since the change in government, there seems to be an attitude, well, don't mind the planners, let's hear to the people who have the vested interest and let them decide what should be in the legislation. And there are sections of the new Planning and Development Act that were clearly written with the point of view of one sector only, and it wasn't the planners. And I think it's important that within the Institute, we get the views of everybody, come together with a view as to what is best for planning rather than for the vested interests, and do that. And that's exactly what we did with the exempted development submission we made to the department last year, and again a further one this year when it went out on public consultation. But we're still waiting for a workshop meeting with the department, just ourselves and the department, and exactly the thing that Sean is talking about, or that Gavin is talking about, whereby we look at it and we stress test it and see, will it work? And in my view, the Institute is much more collaborative in that context than perhaps some of the other lobbyists that are knocking on the doors of government.
So we've talked about the Act, which has kept both of you very busy over the last 2 years, but thinking now about the other things that you've achieved over the last 2 years at the council as council members and Honorary Secretary, in your case, Philip, and Gavin, obviously, in your presidency. Philip, what other things have the Council done over the last 2 years that you're particularly proud of?
Well, I think I could divide that into two. Firstly, internal within the Institute, and secondly, external. In the internal thing, we've had a new constitution, helped very much by an advisor we had on corporate governance, Senan Turnbull. And we have a new constitution which was adopted last December and is going to come into force on the 4th of December this year. And that has completely simplified the original IPI constitution that came out in 1982. That includes a series then of bylaws which we have brought through successfully through Council over the last year, and they're just 3 weeks ago has been adopted by an extraordinary general meeting of the Institute. So in terms of governance, we're going to have an entirely new system within the IPI, and I think that's a huge achievement, helped by Senan's very strong and useful advice. But all of that is internal to the Institute. I think the biggie in terms of external, apart from our input on the Act and the regs, has been the whole issue of resourcing. And two of the big achievements, I think, of this Council, under Gavin's leadership, has been we've got planning now accepted by the Department of whatever they call themselves this week, Department of Enterprise or whatever it is now, on critical skills. So people from outside the EU can now get jobs in planning in Ireland, and we're no doubt about it. The fact that it took 2 years to get it through, but the fact that they're now accepting that there's such a shortage of planners that we need to go outside the EU is important. The other bit, of course, is how we get people coming back. And one of the big things which was there since 2011 was a circular that said, if you wanted to work in a local authority and you came from outside Ireland or outside the local authority system, you had to start at the bottom of the salary tree. And we had an entire generation of planners, Irish planners, who moved across to the UK in particular during the many downturns we had in the 80s and 90s. Those people would have 10, 15, 20 years experience as planners. Yet they were being told, if you want to work in a local authority, you start at the bottom of the grade. We've managed to get that changed. So those are two really practical things at the Institute, by hard lobbying and a lot of pressing of people's pressing them at meetings, saying, oh yes, this is important. And they say, oh well, it's not our job, it's another department. And we pushed it. Those things will mean we'll get a lot of new planners coming into the Irish planning system from abroad, which will only help, among other things, getting different views on planning from different backgrounds, but also, as Gavin mentioned, it will help the timing. So planning decisions will be made more quickly, which everybody needs. So I think as an institute, we have done very, very well, both externally and internally in the last 2 years.
I suppose my achievements or the things that I think that the Institute has done exceptionally well over the last 2 years are very much similar to what Philip has said. I think the burden or the job of work to transform our constitution and our governance into the system that we have now in place, to modernise it, so to speak, was nothing other than a Herculean task, led thankfully by Philip, very adept in dealing with these things. And without him, we wouldn't have achieved that, I don't think, in the last 2 years. The other thing I think I'm very proud of that Philip hasn't alluded to would be our engagement with the Royal Town Planning Institute and the maturing of that relationship. It has always been an irk of mine that the Institute has a reciprocal arrangement, or has an arrangement with RTPI members, where if you're a member of the RTPI, you can become or automatically qualify as a member of a corporate member of, or now registered member of, the Irish Planning Institute. And I felt that it should be reciprocated. I don't believe that Irish planners and qualified Irish planners and experienced Irish planners are any less able or capable than our UK counterparts. And what we see is a lot of very accomplished Irish planners moving over to the UK and taking on very significant roles and becoming very successful within the planning community in the UK. And to me, it was really, really important that the maturity of that relationship between the two institutes developed, and that a level of respect, proper respect, was given to by both sides to each other. And I think something that has happened over my time as president is walking through pretty much an open door with the RTPI and its current organisation. And I'm very, very pleased with how, one, the fact we were invited, yourself and myself were invited to the Royal Town Planning Institute's annual conference, which I think was a huge honour and hugely magnanimous of them to do for us, and very respectful. Showed a huge amount of respect to have us talking on a stage as we were about sustainability and even global and sustainability goals. So that was a really, really, really important part, I think, of the 3 years. The other thing that I think I'm proud of is sort of bringing planning into the mainstream. And one of the things that I thought was exceptionally funny recently, my daughter is studying engineering in Trinity, and the Trinity Engineering Society asked me to do a little vignette or podcast on what is town planning and what do I do as president of the Irish Planning Institute, which I did for them. Not if it would have any real consequence. And it was a mini project that they had to do, the engineers had to do, as to what other professions are available for them other than for engineering. And we also spoke, it was in the context of looking at a project that we're trying to develop to put a stadium offshore, believe it or not, in Dublin Bay, a mad concept. But because of that podcast, I've become exceptionally well known to what is now the third year class of engineers in Trinity. And very funnily, one of my daughter's friends asked me, he said, like, you know, why isn't your dad on telly more explaining all this stuff? He's really good at explaining it. And to me, that is a huge clap in the back. That's why I set out to do, was to basically try and simplify planning to help people understand what it is we do, to gain a little bit more respect for what we do, and to give a voice to the people who really can't speak about what they do in planning. I mean, I have a huge number of friends who are inspectors in the commission, and they are horribly frustrated with some of the things that have been happening in the media and haven't had a voice or an ability to be able to express that frustration or clarify some of the misnomers that are thrown out there, like Philip said. I don't hold the view that it's a particular vested interest that's trying to shout. I think it's the media who's interested in what makes more people listen to it, what's more controversial. And that's what they want to hear. They're looking for opposing views as opposed to particular views. And I think because they're looking for those opposing views and planners haven't been good at voicing their opinion, that we have been sort of left in the position there, the wilderness that we've been in. But so one of the things I'm particularly proud of is being able to bring to the media a stronger planning voice that shows the balance, that expresses that balance. And it's something I would be always very mindful when I'm speaking in the media about planning and on behalf of the Institute, that it's not my views, but rather a global view of the Institute. And that global view is taken from what was the council, what will be the new board of the IPI. And it's a very diverse voice. It's a very diverse church. And so it should be. It's something I very much welcome, the difference of opinion. One thing's for certain, myself and Philip do not see life through the same lens when it comes to planning. But I think because of the respect we have for each other and each other's views, it helps us to understand much better and to temper our own views in terms of where the best outcomes can be reached. And I think that's what planning is about, is that, for want of a better description, negotiated settlement of views. And you get a much better solution when you're prepared to sit down with somebody who you don't agree with and listen. And that's one of the things that I'm very proud of in the council that I've led, is that I've sought to do that. I've sought, and I want to hear opposing views. I want to hear different views, because with those different views, no matter how extreme they are, if you properly listen to, engage with them, I think you end up in a much better place.
And Philip, thinking back over your 26 and a quarter years, what advice would you have for new council becoming the board of directors? What advice would you have for those new board members, or for members who are maybe looking to get involved in the Institute in some way?
Roll up your sleeves and get stuck in. That'd be the key piece of advice. Like, if you care about your profession, get involved with the Institute. For God's sake. I mean, one person said it to me, and what actually motivated me to get involved with the Institute. Everybody thinks about and looks at the Institute about how much effort goes into it. And if I've heard it once, I've heard it 50 times over the last even 6 months. God, you must take so much time. It doesn't if everybody does a little bit. And that's something that I've been absolutely blessed with in terms of with the outgoing council. To a person, they have put Herculean effort in all various different guises and in their own particular way in the thing that they're interested in. And that makes life so much easier if everybody's lifting at the same time. Like lifting a big heavy table. If there's 10 people around it and they're all putting effort in at the same time, it's much easier than there's only 2 of you. So I would say to people, get involved. Every little counts, to use the Tesco motto. The more that people are involved, the more that the industry thrives, the more that we hear those disparate voices, and the more effort we have going in to making the Institute better than it is. It has improved immeasurably. We've grown our membership. We want to grow that further. And I would strongly, strongly encourage anybody who's in planning, get involved. Get involved in the IPI in no matter how small a way. There's a place for you to be involved in the Institute. One of the committees, inputting into the policy groups. Look at your emails. When the Institute calls for help, get involved.
And Philip, what would you say to people looking to get involved?
Well, before I say that, I would just like to acknowledge how a very reasonable president Gavin has been, listening to all points of view. And he's right, I don't have the same view of planning as he does, but it's been a very open situation on the IPI Council for the last 2 years. I don't think we've had a single vote on any issue in that whole time. We end up as a consensus view on what we want to say to the public, what we want to say to politicians, and what we say to our own members. And I would credit Gavin with being somebody who does indeed listen. Unfortunately, in the past, some of our presidents haven't been so open to being consensus driven. And I very much would like to say it here that I think Gavin has done a great job as president in getting everybody together. In terms of what you have for council, new people coming on to the board, I will say 2 things. Number one, it's kind of like, what did the Romans ever do for us? When you actually go through it, a lot of people have contributed in various different ways, from being on the council, from being on committees, whatever, to the Institute. And that gives us that external voice, which is unbiased. But even if people were just looking at it, what can they get out of being on the IPI Council? Well, first of all, the IPI is a profession. So really, if you're interested in planning, not as a job, but as a profession, it behoves you to contribute to your profession. When I came back onto the IPI, having retired, I felt I was giving something back to the Institute. While I was a board member in Bord Pleanála for 6 years, I was debarred from going on the IPI Council because of obvious conflicts of interest. I've tried to give something back, and I think a lot of us in planning can give something back. I know it's time consuming, but I'd agree with Gavin. If everybody does a bit of lifting, a lot more is done than if only 3 or 4 people are doing it. But purely from their own point of view, they get an opportunity to network. And if they're younger planners in particular, network with somebody that they might be working for or with in the future. And that's good for their career. But that's, if you like, the way of looking at it from a personal point of view. But it's to give back to your profession. Because if we didn't have that, it would be run as some things in life are, not at the Institute. 3 or 4 people deciding what should be done. By getting involved, you're giving your particular view, whether it be a public sector view, whether it be a private consultant's view, whether it be a state agency view, whatever it might be, you're giving your bit and your perspective on what the way the Institute should say publicly and privately, internally as well. It's a good thing to do. And I mean, having been co-opted and then elected for numbers of years, if somebody thinks your view is okay, they'll vote for you. If you know people, one way of getting involved for somebody who's not on the board is volunteering for one of the committees. And that means not only will you get the views of other colleagues from different sectors, but it'll also mean you know what's going on before the public and the rest of the planners around the country know, because you're literally into the minutiae of regulations, you're into the minutiae of the Act, whatever it might be. And even down to if we have an annual conference and a winter conference an autumn conference every year, literally going along to Sean or to Shelley and say, look, I'm happy to give an hour or 2 holding a mic. I'm happy to help out volunteering in some way or other. I mean, it might be just helping out with the mic means you get in for free to the conference. I don't want to take away the money we might need, but somebody prepared to give a couple of hours of their time once a year, then get involved. And once you get involved, you'll discover you can get more out of it than you put in, as long as you put something in. So I would encourage, like Gavin, everybody to consider it. The great advantage of going up and volunteering for a committee is you don't have to go before an electorate. We've just finished our elections. We had, I don't know how many, then we'll get the figures by the AGM, but you put yourself up for election, you might get it, you might not. By just volunteering, by sending a letter or an email nowadays to Sean, you could obviously end up as part of a committee that contributes to the Institute. And that is rewarding for you, but also helping you possibly, particularly if you're starting in your career. God knows, you might be sitting around a council table or a board table with somebody who you might meet then 6 months later at an interview board. Think about it in that way. So, there's things for the Institute, but there's things for you. That's the way I'd look at it.
I'd also say, just Sean, I think one of the things that is hugely beneficial, you end up having influence on your profession. If you really do care about it and it really does something really irks you or sparks you, if you get involved in one of our committees, you can actually make a difference. You can have your voice heard. You can actually influence outcomes. But if you sit in the wings and you moan and you groan about it and you talk to people in the newspapers about it, that ability to influence is lessened. And we would hope that the IPI going forward is going to be a stronger and louder voice, both in government circles and in media circles.
And then just looking ahead to 2026, Philip, maybe you first. What do you think is going to be the biggest challenge for planners and planning in 2026, and what's going to be the role of the Institute in dealing with that challenge or opportunity?
Well, I'd put it in two terms. First of all, that we can try and get away from the people scapegoating us. And Gavin has led on that with his conference speech on that subject. And make what is a complex picture not unidirectional, it's all the planner's fault. It isn't. And I think that's going to be an issue for the board, from the board of the IPI and the IPI generally over the next year. But the biggest challenge out there isn't housing, isn't resourcing, it's climate change. And planners have a huge role to play in that. And from the most junior person dealing with a planning application to somebody who's the chief planner trying to persuade their elected members of what should be or shouldn't be in a development plan, these are the things that are really going to affect people. I'm lucky enough to be retired, but I don't have to worry about what the climate's likely to be in 2060. But those who are coming into the profession now will, and hopefully planning can make a difference to that. And if you were sitting in a house in the middle of nowhere when Storm Owen hit and your electricity was gone for 3 weeks because of bad planning on the part of forestry on the one hand and DSB on the other, planning can make a difference to these kind of things. If you were sitting in a house and then the rain came down and you were flooded out, planning can make a difference to these things. We are the ones who can advise the decision makers on a lot of these issues. And to me, the biggest threat to Ireland is climate change. It's not housing. That'll be solved eventually, depending on which government is in force and what policies they do. It's not resourcing for planners, which is very much if you like, an IPI thing. It's climate change, and we can make a difference to our environment in the future if we are serious about it and not let the old, let's go the way we've always gone and it'll be all right at the end. It won't be all right at the end. So for me, that is probably the biggest challenge, both for ourselves and for as planners, but also for the state. But in essence, the biggest challenge for IPI in the next year and a half, 2 years, is going to be bedding down the new legislation and trying to talk sense to some of those writing it, that some of the bits just won't work and they need to change it. But ideally, will you stop messing with the planning system and try and let people settle down and try and do the thing we have? That it may be bad, but making changes every 6 months to suit the next election or whatever is not going to solve that problem.
And Gavin, same question to you. What does 2026 hold for planning and planners in the Institute?
I very much echo everything that Philip has said. I think one of the biggest challenges we're going to have as planners is getting stuff done. I think it's going to be really, really difficult. Very few of the planning authorities have actually managed to get their head around the new planning framework and get on with getting ahead with amending their plans. So there's a job of work to do there. There's the new Planning Act and the implementation of that and figuring that out and teasing that out. And then testing some of the regulation when they do come through, because it would appear that we're going to get the regulations and just have to crack on with it. And if that's the case, that's the case. We're more than capable of doing it as a profession. As I said many times before, you're not going to find a planner wanting in terms of doing their job or role. we'll roll our sleeves up and we'll get stuck in. But I think the other big issue is the whole narrative around beyond next year. Exactly as Philip says, when you start to mix in biodiversity, climate change, housing crisis, infrastructure crisis, we need to do a lot more planning. And we need to, in order to do that, we need a bit of time and space to get there. What we don't need is more guidelines and more legislation, just time and space. Good planning is good planning. We know how to do it. We don't need a rule book or a guidebook. We need a little bit of time. And we need a little bit of time to get on and implement the strategies. What has happened, I think, over the past 10 years in particular, is we've got so many rule books and so much legislation thrown on top of us that it's difficult to potentially provide for what is and what we would understand to be as good planning. And there's little room and little time for proper debate about what good looks like. And I think that's always a challenge. But so for next year, I think for the Institute and for planning, it's keep on fighting the good fight. It's keep on correcting misnomers about what we do in planning. It's keep on explaining what we do well. It's keep on dealing with the issues that are going to present themselves. Hopefully next year, and I do see green shoots, and I said this recently at a seminar, I do really see green shoots happening. I do see some of the things, the changes that the government have made, making a difference. Things that we've done 2 years ago are now going to start to bear fruit in 2026. What we need to do is nurture them and encourage them and get on with things. Thankfully, on Commission Pleanála, it looks like it's properly resourced now going forward with a proper governance structure, which is really good, really, really positive. Hopefully we can do the same for local authorities going forward. I know there's significant vacancies all around the country, and hopefully we can encourage more people next year to take up the career of planning. Would be a fantastic success in 2026 is to see a bigger intake again of students into the various planning schools. So if we could manage to achieve all that, I think we'd be doing well in 2026.
Gavin, Philip, thanks a million for joining me on the podcast, and thanks for all your work over the last 2 years as Honorary Secretary and President of the IPI.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Sean.
If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you'll get the next episode automatically, and remember to share it with a friend in the sector. Just tell them to search Irish Planning Institute on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by the Irish Planning Institute. From me, Sean O'Leary, thank you for listening.